My mother-in-law slapped my 6-year-old son at Thanksgiving dinner. She screamed that he was not real family and ordered him to get out. He hit the floor in front of the entire family, but no one dared speak. They acted as if nothing had happened. I did not cry. I said 5 words. She dropped her plate. The room froze. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down a toxic family empire to protect your peace. My name is Melanie, and I am 33 years old. The Harrison family Thanksgiving was supposed to be a picture of New England perfection. The grand dining table at their opulent Connecticut estate was set with crystal glasses, polished silver, and an extravagant floral centerpiece that probably cost more than most people make in a month. To anyone looking through the floor-to-ceiling windows, we were the ideal American family sharing a holiday meal. But sitting in that dining room felt like being trapped in a beautiful, suffocating cage. I had spent the entire evening trying to keep the peace. My mother-in-law, Barbara, a woman in her late 60s who treated wealth as a personality trait, had been making passive-aggressive comments since the moment we walked through the heavy oak front doors. Her targets were rarely direct, but they always landed exactly where she intended. Tonight her target was my son Leo. Leo is 6 years old. He is my biological son from my late first husband, a wonderful man who passed away before Leo even took his first steps. When I married David 3 years ago, I thought I was giving Leo a father and a stable, loving family. David legally adopted Leo, promising to love him as his own blood. But as time went on, David slowly morphed into a spineless enabler of his mother's cruelty, always prioritizing the Harrison image over his wife and son. I had married David believing he was different from his pretentious relatives. During our courtship, he played the role of the grounded, loving partner perfectly. But looking back, the signs of his true nature had always been there. The way he never contradicted his mother. The way he allowed his sister to make snide comments without consequence. I had mistaken his cowardice for a desire for peace. The tension at the table was thick enough to choke on. Barbara sat at the head of the table sipping her expensive red wine and watching Leo with a hawk-like intensity. Every time Leo shifted in his chair or asked for a roll, Barbara would let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "Children should be seen and not heard," she remarked, her eyes fixed on Leo. Though in some cases not being seen at all would be preferable. I gripped my napkin tightly under the table. "Barbara, he is just asking for the butter," I said, keeping my voice remarkably calm. "He has been perfectly well behaved all evening." Barbara waved her hand dismissively. "I suppose one can only expect so much given his background." Blood always tells, Melanie. The Harrison bloodline is accustomed to a certain standard of decorum. The insult was blatant. She was reminding everyone at the table that Leo did not share their DNA. I looked across the table at David, waiting for him to defend his legally adopted son, waiting for him to be the man I thought I had married. David simply looked down at his roasted turkey and took a bite, pretending he had not heard a word. William, my father-in-law, kept his eyes glued to his plate, chewing methodically. He was a man who avoided conflict at all costs, content to let his wife rule the household with an iron fist, as long as it did not disturb his peace. Next to him sat Courtney, my 30-year-old sister-in-law, and the undisputed golden child of the family. Courtney rolled her eyes and huffed in annoyance, clearly irritated that the attention was not entirely focused on her recent luxury shopping trip. I reached over and placed my hand over Leo's small one, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You are doing great, sweetie," I whispered to him. "Just finish your dinner and we can go home." But the evening was far from over. The dining room felt like a powder keg waiting for a match. Barbara continued to direct icy glares at my son, waiting for any excuse to strike. The opportunity arrived just as dessert was being brought out by the catering staff. Leo asked to be excused to use the restroom. As he slid out of his large, heavy dining chair, his small foot caught on the edge of the thick Persian rug. He stumbled slightly, and his elbow bumped the mahogany side table next to Barbara. On that side table sat a tall, ornate crystal wine glass. The glass wobbled. It tilted slightly to the side, then rocked back into place. It did not break. It did not fall. It did not even spill a single drop of wine onto the polished wood surface. But that wobble was all Barbara needed. In a flash of unhinged rage, Barbara stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Before I could even register what was happening, she lunged forward. Her hand swung through the air and struck Leo hard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the massive dining room like a gunshot. Leo stumbled backward from the force of the blow, his small body hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. He let out a sharp cry of shock and pain, his hand flying to his reddening cheek. "He is not real family!" Barbara screamed, her face contorted with pure hatred. "Get out of my house!" Time seemed to stop. The air sucked completely out of the room. I leaped from my chair, my heart pounding against my ribs, and dropped to my knees beside my son. I pulled Leo into my arms, holding him tightly as he buried his face in my neck and sobbed. I checked his cheek, which was already blooming into a bright, angry red mark. My blood turned to ice. It was the kind of cold, calculating rage that does not require yelling or screaming. It requires destruction. I looked up, expecting the room to be in an uproar. I expected William to restrain his wife. I expected Courtney to gasp in horror. Most of all, I expected David to jump over the table to protect his son. Instead, I was met with deafening, complicit silence. William continued to stare at his plate, refusing to look at his grandson crying on the floor. Courtney leaned back in her chair, rolled her eyes, and let out an exasperated sigh, as if my son being physically assaulted was merely an annoying disruption to her dessert course. I turned my gaze to David, my husband, the man who stood in a courtroom and swore to protect this child. David was shrinking back into his grand dining chair. He looked at his mother, then looked at me. His face was pale, cowardly, and pathetic. He leaned forward slightly and whispered in a hushed, urgent tone, "Just take him to the car, Melanie. Do not make a scene. Do not make a scene." Those words echoed in my mind, severing the final thread of loyalty I held for this man and his family. He was asking me to quietly accept the physical abuse of our child to protect his mother's ego. He wanted me to scurry away into the night so they could finish their pumpkin pie in peace. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for victims, and I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their impending ruin. I slowly stood up, bringing Leo up with me. I kept him tucked safely behind my legs, shielding him from the monster at the head of the table. Barbara was standing tall, breathing heavily, looking incredibly smug. She adjusted her pearl necklace and lifted her chin, fully expecting me to grab my purse and run away crying. She expected me to shrink. She expected me to bow to the wealth and power of the Harrison family. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. I looked at William, who was still avoiding my gaze. I looked at Courtney, who was already reaching for her phone. I looked at David, who was staring at me with wide, pleading eyes, begging me to just be quiet and leave. Finally, I locked eyes with Barbara. The room was so silent you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I held her gaze, letting the pure, unfiltered disdain radiate from my eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or yell. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying calmness that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. I own this entire estate. The 5 words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. For a moment, nobody processed what I had said. The Harrisons were so wrapped up in their illusion of superiority that the words simply bounced off their egos. But then the reality of my statement began to penetrate Barbara's mind. I watched her mind race, trying to categorize my statement as a bluff. But she saw the cold certainty in my posture. She remembered the hushed, panicked phone calls her husband had been making for the past 6 months. She remembered the bankers they had been avoiding. My words were the final puzzle piece locking into place, revealing a picture she was entirely unprepared to look at. Her smug expression faltered. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking old and hollow. Her hands began to tremble. She was holding a fine china dessert plate, ready to serve herself a slice of pie. As the truth of my words hit her, her fingers went slack. The expensive imported china plate slipped from her grasp. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. The sound of the breaking porcelain broke the spell in the room. David finally sat up, his mouth opening in confusion. William's head snapped up, his eyes wide with sudden terror. They knew. Deep down, they knew their financial secrets were not as safe as they thought. I did not offer an explanation. I did not stay to watch them scramble for words or try to demand answers. The time for talking was over. I turned my back on the shattered plate and the shattered family. I calmly walked to the coat rack in the grand foyer. I helped Leo into his warm winter coat, buttoning it up to his chin with steady hands. I put on my own coat, picked up my keys, and opened the heavy front door. I walked out into the crisp, cold Thanksgiving night, leaving the front door wide open behind me. I buckled Leo safely into his car seat in the back of my vehicle, assuring him once again that he was safe and that nobody would ever hurt him again. As I pulled the car down the long, winding, tree-lined driveway of the estate, I looked in the rearview mirror. I could see the warm light spilling out from the open front door of the mansion. Inside, I knew the Harrison family was standing in a state of confused, arrogant denial, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had just been legally pulled away. They thought they were untouchable. They thought their money and their name gave them the right to abuse my child. But they were about to learn a very painful lesson about power, wealth, and what happens when you push a mother too far. The heater in my car hummed a steady, quiet rhythm as we glided down the dark, winding roads away from the Harrison estate. In the rearview mirror, I could see Leo fast asleep in his car seat. His breathing was even, but the angry red welt on his left cheek stood out sharply in the passing streetlights. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sheer restraint it took not to turn the car around and burn that mansion to the ground was staggering. But I did not need to use fire. I had something much more effective. As the miles stretched between us and that toxic dining room, my mind replayed the last 3 years of my life. I thought about David. 6 months ago, my professional world collided with my personal life in a way I never expected. I was running a routine conflict of interest check for a new corporate client when a familiar name flagged in our database: William Harrison, my father-in-law. What I uncovered over the next 48 hours of deep forensic digging left me speechless. The great Harrison empire was a complete fabrication. William Harrison was entirely irrevocably bankrupt. The truth was hidden beneath layers of shell corporations and creative accounting, but the numbers do not lie. The family money had dried up nearly a decade ago. Every single thing they paraded in front of their friends, the lavish charity galas, Courtney's designer wardrobes, the imported luxury vehicles, the sprawling Connecticut estate, was financed by a mountain of toxic debt. To save his vanity and maintain their precious country club lifestyle, William had taken out a massive, high-interest private equity loan against the estate. He bet everything on a commercial real estate venture that crashed and burned. When I dug deeper into the loan documents, I found the fatal blow. William had defaulted. He had missed 3 consecutive payments. The private equity firm was gearing up to call in the loan, seize the estate, and publicly auction it off. The Harrisons were weeks away from total financial ruin. They were about to be stripped of their home, their status, and their pride. They were going to be the laughingstock of their elite circle. I remember sitting in my office late that night, staring at the glowing monitors, feeling a profound sense of loyalty. Despite Barbara's coldness and Courtney's snark, they were my husband's family. I loved David. I believed foolishly that we were a unit. I could not let my husband's parents lose their home and face public humiliation. I wanted to be the one to save them. So I made a move that only someone in my position could make. I did not use our joint accounts. I did not touch a single penny of David's money. I leveraged my own private premarital assets, the wealth I had built from the ground up long before I ever met David. I established a blind, limited liability company to mask my identity. Then, using my firm's connections, I approached the private equity group holding William's defaulted loan. They were thrilled to offload the bad debt. I purchased the distressed loan in its entirety. I bought the paper. I bought the mortgage. I bought the deed. I effectively became the sole owner of the Harrison estate. My plan had been deeply, embarrassingly sentimental. I had instructed my legal team to draft the transfer documents. I intended to place the deed to the estate in a beautiful envelope, wrap it in a red ribbon, and hand it to David on Christmas morning. I was going to wipe away his father's debt and secure his family's home forever. It was meant to be the ultimate gesture of loyalty and love, a silent vow that I would always protect the people he cared about. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The streetlights washed over Leo's sleeping face, highlighting the bruising skin on his cheek. The image burned itself into my retinas. That twisted, misguided loyalty died the moment Barbara's hand struck my son. It died when Courtney rolled her eyes. It died when William stared at his plate. And it was buried the second David told me to quietly drag my crying child out the back door. They did not want me as family. They made that abundantly clear. But they were about to learn that the woman they dismissed as unworthy held their entire world in the palm of her hand. The blind LLC was ironclad. The defaulted loan was legally binding. There was no grace period left. There was no negotiation to be had. The deed was mine, and the Christmas gift was officially canceled. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my mind shifting from the grief of a failed marriage to the cold, calculated strategy of a forensic audit. David wanted to play the role of the obedient Harrison son. He could have it. But he was going to experience exactly what it meant to be a Harrison without my invisible shield protecting them. I pulled into the driveway of our home, the quiet suburban house that I paid the mortgage on. I turned off the engine and unbuckled my seatbelt. I carefully lifted Leo from his car seat, holding his warm, sleeping body against my chest. As I carried him up the walkway and unlocked the front door, my plan crystallized. I would not wait for apologies that would never come. I would not entertain excuses or listen to David beg for me to be the bigger person. The time for being the bigger person was over. Tomorrow morning, I would call my attorney. I would trigger the foreclosure process on the Harrison estate. I would systematically dismantle the illusion they had spent a decade protecting. They wanted to cast my son out of their home. Now I was going to cast them out of mine. I carried Leo upstairs and gently laid him in his bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. I kissed his forehead, making a silent promise to him in the dark room. Nobody would ever touch him again. Nobody would ever make him feel less than perfect. I walked into my home office, powered on my computer, and opened the encrypted files containing the Harrison family's financial ruin. The screen illuminated the dark room with cold, hard numbers. The numbers that belonged to me. I reached for my phone and drafted an email to my lead counsel, marking it with high priority for Monday morning. The game had changed, and the Harrisons were completely unarmed. But David, emboldened by a weekend of his mother's relentless manipulation and his own inflated sense of superiority, decided to make his first massive tactical error. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, my phone vibrated loudly against the wood of my desk. It was an automated alert from my banking application. A second later, another alert popped up, then a third. I unlocked the screen and opened the application. I sat perfectly still, watching in real time as the balances in our joint checking and savings accounts plummeted rapidly to zero. David was frantically transferring every single cent into an external account solely in his name. He withdrew the mortgage fund. He withdrew the emergency house repair fund. He took the grocery budget. The joint checking account was drained of exactly $4,212. The savings account was emptied of $15,000. A moment later, an email notification appeared in my inbox from my credit card provider. The primary cardholder, David Harrison, had reported the accounts compromised and officially canceled my authorized user access across all platforms. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a direct text message from David. "You are delusional and you need help. You have no money until you apologize to my mother for ruining Thanksgiving." I sat back in my ergonomic office chair, folded my hands in my lap, and simply smiled at the screen. I did not panic. I did not feel my chest tighten with anxiety. I did not burst into tears. I actually felt a genuine deep wave of amusement wash over me. David fundamentally misunderstood the woman he was married to. He thought he had just executed a masterful, crippling financial checkmate. He thought he had cut off my air supply, isolated me, and forced me into absolute submission. What David failed to realize, despite living with me for 3 years, was that the joint accounts he had just triumphantly drained were nothing more than decoy funds. As a forensic accountant who spends her life untangling complex corporate fraud, I never merge my primary assets. The joint accounts he raided held exactly enough money to cover our monthly suburban mortgage, our utility bills, and our basic living expenses. It was a glorified household allowance pool. My real wealth, the multi-million-dollar portfolio built entirely from my firm. My private investments and my premarital trusts remained completely separate. It was legally insulated, tightly encrypted, and absolutely untouchable by him. David had just declared total financial warfare by stealing the grocery money, fully believing he had crippled a titan of industry. He had played his hand, and it was the weakest, most embarrassing hand imaginable. I picked up my office phone and dialed a premium locksmith service I frequently contracted for securing commercial properties after hostile takeovers. I requested an emergency residential rekeying for my home address, authorizing their highest priority rate. Then I calmly cleared my morning schedule, grabbed my wool coat, and drove back out to the suburbs. I made a brief stop at a local hardware store to purchase 4 large boxes of heavy-duty industrial-strength black trash bags. When I pulled into my driveway, the locksmith's van was already waiting by the curb. The technician worked quickly and efficiently, swapping out the deadbolts on the front door, the back patio sliding glass door, and the garage entrance. I handed him my platinum corporate card, the one tied directly to my firm that David had absolutely zero access to, and tipped him generously for his speed. I stood in the foyer of my quiet house, the new keys heavy and satisfying in my palm. This was my house. I paid the down payment. I carried the mortgage. David had just been a permanent guest, playing house on my dime. Now his tenancy was officially terminated. I walked straight into the master bedroom and opened the double doors to David's expansive walk-in closet. I did not gently fold anything. I did not neatly pack his custom-tailored suits or carefully wrap his expensive Italian leather shoes. I ripped open the first thick black plastic bag and started shoving his entire life into it. I yanked his silk ties off the rack. I threw in his cashmere sweaters, the ones his mother bought him for Christmas, and the pastel golf polos he wore to his father's bankrupt country club. I swept his designer colognes, his expensive watch winders, and his silver cufflinks off the bathroom vanity, letting them tumble into the plastic with a loud, satisfying clatter. I found his hidden stash of premium cigars and tossed them in with his running shoes. I emptied his bedside table drawer, dumping his charging cables, stray receipts, and loose change into the plastic maw. I felt no sorrow. I felt no nostalgia looking at the shirts I had bought him for our anniversaries. I only felt the clinical precision of an auditor liquidating a toxic asset. The marriage was functionally bankrupt, and I was simply executing the closure. I moved to the spare room he called his office. I bagged up his framed diplomas, his pretentious desk accessories, and the framed photographs of his arrogant family. I took a strange, methodical pleasure in the physical labor of erasing him from my sanctuary. Every item I threw into a garbage bag represented a lie he had told, a boundary he had crossed, and a moment he had failed to protect my son. It took me exactly 2 hours to entirely purge David's presence from my home. I dragged 16 heavy black trash bags down the hallway, pulling them through the grand foyer and out the front door. I lined them up aggressively along the edge of the front porch, creating a towering, undeniable wall of garbage that accurately represented the sum total of our marriage. I stepped back inside and locked the brand new deadbolt behind me, the heavy metallic click echoing with absolute finality in the quiet suburban air. I did not reply to his threatening text message. I did not call him to demand the return of the joint funds. I simply let the dead silence communicate my response. David wanted to use money to control me. He wanted to starve me out, break my spirit, and force me to crawl back to his mother's feet, begging for forgiveness. But by the time he realized his little financial stunt had achieved absolutely nothing, he would be standing on a cold concrete porch, locked out of the house I owned, staring at his entire existence packed into garbage bags. He thought he was teaching me a lesson in submission. Instead, he had just handed me the match to light the fuse. The warning period was officially over and the demolition of the Harrison family had begun. The rest of Monday passed with a quiet, productive rhythm. My phone remained silent. David had clearly discovered the mountain of heavy-duty trash bags on the front porch and realized the locks were changed. He did not bang on the door. He did not demand entry. Knowing his cowardly nature, he likely retreated straight back to the Harrison estate to lick his wounds and plot with his mother. I spent Tuesday working from my home office, keeping Leo happily occupied with his favorite building blocks after school. The house felt lighter, cleansed of the toxic, passive-aggressive energy that had infected it for the past 3 years. I went to sleep that night feeling a profound sense of peace, knowing that the structural rot of my marriage had finally been excised from my home. That peace was violently interrupted on Wednesday afternoon. I was reviewing a particularly dense corporate audit on my dual monitors, while Leo sat at the kitchen island, diligently coloring a picture of a dinosaur. The sudden sharp knocking at the front door was not the polite tap of a delivery driver. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of state officials. I glanced at the security camera feed displayed on the corner of my right monitor. 2 women stood on my front porch. They wore sensible professional coats and carried thick clipboards. They possessed the unmistakable world-weary posture of social workers. My forensic instincts immediately cataloged their demeanor. They were not selling anything. They were here on official business. Then my eyes drifted to the secondary camera feed, the one capturing the wide-angle view of the street and the end of my long driveway. My blood ran completely cold, instantly replacing my calm afternoon with a chilling, hyper-focused clarity. Parked illegally near the fire hydrant at the edge of my property was a familiar imported luxury sedan. Standing leaning against the hood were David and Barbara. They were not trying to hide. They were positioned perfectly to have a clear, unobstructed view of my front door. Barbara wore her signature cashmere wrap, clutching a designer handbag, her face twisted into a mask of triumphant expectation. David stood beside her with his arms crossed over his chest, looking incredibly smug. David checked his expensive watch, likely counting down the seconds until he could play the hero. Barbara adjusted her sunglasses, whispering something to him that made them both smirk. He had the posture of a man who believed he had just delivered the ultimate inescapable death blow. The pieces of their pathetic strategy snapped together in my mind with terrifying speed. When draining the joint accounts failed to force me into submission, when locking David out demonstrated my absolute refusal to play their games, they decided to escalate to the nuclear option. They realized they could not control me with money, so they went after the only true vulnerability I had left. They targeted my 6-year-old child. They had made an anonymous call to Child Protective Services. I zoomed in on the security feed, analyzing their expressions. Barbara was practically vibrating with anticipation. She was waiting for the front door to open. She was waiting for me to dissolve into a puddle of hysterical, terrified tears. They expected me to panic at the sight of state investigators. They expected me to drop to my knees, realize the absolute peril I was in, and sprint down the driveway to beg for David's help to keep my son. They thought dragging state officials into my home with fabricated, highly exaggerated claims of physical abuse and an unstable, dangerous environment would finally break my spirit and force me to surrender the deed to their estate. It was a devastatingly cruel maneuver. To use a government agency designed to protect children in genuine danger as a weapon for personal retaliation was vile. But as I stared at their smug faces on the monitor, I did not feel the panic they were banking on. I felt the final definitive death of any lingering sympathy I might have harbored for the man I married. I took a slow, deep breath, regulating my heart rate. I closed the audit file on my computer screen. In my line of work, navigating hostile audits, federal investigators, and aggressive corporate attorneys was simply a regular occurrence. I am a managing partner of a firm that handles multi-million-dollar fraud cases. I have sat across the table from federal agents who carry weapons and subpoenas. 2 overworked state caseworkers responding to a malicious anonymous tip did not intimidate me. I knew that in investigations, emotional reactions are interpreted as guilt. Cold, hard facts are the only currency that matters. I knew the law, I knew my rights, and most importantly, I knew that a pristine record of reality was my greatest shield. I walked into the kitchen and knelt beside Leo. He was happily humming a tune, carefully staying within the lines of his coloring book. I stroked his hair, making sure my voice was completely steady and warm. "We have some guests at the door, sweetie," I said gently. "I am going to talk to them in the living room for a little bit. I need you to stay right here and finish your masterpiece. Can you do that for me?" Leo nodded enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the malicious machinery churning outside our front door. I stood up, smoothed down the front of my tailored slacks, and adjusted the cuffs of my silk blouse. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. There was no trace of fear. There was only the polished, impenetrable armor of a professional who was fully prepared to dismantle an accusation brick by brick. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the front door open wide, stepping out onto the porch to meet the investigators. The two women on my porch immediately stiffened, adjusting their clipboards. The taller one, bearing a badge lanyard around her neck, stepped forward with a serious, practiced expression. "Are you Melanie?" she asked, her tone clearly prepared for hostility or defensive outrage. I smiled. It was not a forced, nervous smile, but the warm, confident greeting of a homeowner receiving expected guests. "Yes, I am. Good afternoon. We are investigators with Child Protective Services," the woman continued, holding up her identification. "We received a report regarding the welfare of a minor in this residence, specifically concerning allegations of an unstable and dangerous home environment, as well as potential physical abuse. We need to come inside and speak with you, and we will need to see the child." Out of the corner of my eye, I could see David and Barbara shifting their weight at the end of the driveway, watching intently. I could almost feel their smug satisfaction radiating down the asphalt. They had choreographed this entire moment, plotting it out in the drawing room of their bankrupt mansion, convinced they had finally outmaneuvered me. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for me to start screaming at the investigators, which would instantly validate their anonymous claims of an unstable, volatile mother. Instead, I stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing graciously toward the foyer. "Of course," I said, keeping my voice perfectly modulated, projecting nothing but complete cooperation and professional courtesy. "Please come right in. It is freezing out there today. Let us get you out of the cold." The investigators exchanged a brief, surprised glance. They were clearly accustomed to screaming matches, slammed doors, and terrified parents. Being welcomed inside like visiting dignitaries threw them off their practiced rhythm. They stepped over the threshold, wiping their shoes on the entry mat, their eyes immediately darting around to assess the environment. The foyer was immaculate. The house smelled of the fresh coffee I had brewed an hour earlier, and the subtle scent of vanilla from a candle on the console table. There was no chaos, no screaming, no signs of the dangerous squalor described in the malicious report. The only sound was the faint, happy humming of my son from the adjacent kitchen. "Let me take your coats," I offered, closing the door firmly, intentionally cutting off David and Barbara's view of the proceedings. "No, thank you. We will keep them on the lead," investigator said, trying to regain her authoritative footing. "We need to conduct this interview and see the child immediately." "I completely understand," I replied, guiding them into the pristine, sunlit, formal living room. "My son is in the kitchen, working on an art project. We can certainly speak with him. But first, please have a seat. I just put on a fresh pot of coffee. How do you take yours? Or would you prefer sparkling water?" Again, the absolute normalcy and lack of panic in my voice seemed to disorient them. I was not acting like an abuser hiding a dark secret. I was acting like a managing partner hosting a client meeting. "We are fine. Thank you," the second investigator said, taking a seat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her pen hovering over her clipboard. "We are here because a highly concerning anonymous tip reported severe physical altercations and a chaotic living situation that poses an immediate threat to your son." I sat down in the armchair across from them, crossing my legs elegantly and folding my hands. I maintained unwavering eye contact with the lead investigator. "I am fully aware of the gravity of such accusations. I stated, my tone shifting from hospitable host to analytical professional. I also appreciate the incredibly difficult and vital work your agency does to protect vulnerable children. I assure you, you will have my absolute unreserved cooperation today. You may inspect every inch of this property, speak with my son privately, and review any documentation you require. I am going to provide you with everything you need to close this file with absolute certainty. The investigators relaxed their shoulders slightly, the defensive tension draining from their postures. The hostile ambush the Harrisons had orchestrated was already neutralizing, dismantled by the one thing they lacked entirely: absolute, undeniable competence. I will excuse myself for a moment, I told the two women sitting rigidly on my velvet sofa. Please make yourselves comfortable. I will be right back with the documentation you require. I did not rush. I walked at a measured, deliberate pace down the hallway to my home office. I unlocked the heavy bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out a thick, leather-bound binder. In my profession, data is armor. I treat my personal life with the exact same level of rigorous organization that I apply to corporate audits. I returned to the living room and placed the heavy binder on the coffee table between us. I opened it and turned the binder to face the lead investigator. Here is my son's complete medical history from the day he was born, I stated smoothly. You will find his immunization records, dental checkups, and detailed notes from his pediatrician, Dr. Evans. You will see that Leo has attended every scheduled well-child visit and has never presented with a single unexplained bruise, fracture, or injury of any kind. I flipped to the next tabbed section. Here are his academic records from his private elementary school. I have included his most recent report card from last week, signed by his principal and his homeroom teacher. They note that Leo is a joyful, highly engaged student who exhibits a secure attachment style and excellent emotional regulation. I also took the liberty of printing out a character reference from our neighborhood association president, who frequently sees us walking our dog in the evenings. The lead investigator picked up the binder, her eyes scanning the pristine, categorized documents. Her posture relaxed significantly. People guilty of child abuse do not maintain meticulously organized, perfectly clean pediatric records. The second investigator leaned in to read over her partner's shoulder. I watched the tension melt out of their shoulders. The narrative of an unhinged, dangerous mother was evaporating under the harsh light of documented reality. However, I understand that paperwork can be forged or curated. I continued, leaning back into my armchair. The anonymous tip claimed that there are violent physical altercations and a chaotic environment in this house. I want to clear that up with absolute certainty. As a managing partner at a financial firm handling highly sensitive data, my home is equipped with a high-definition enterprise-grade security system. We have cameras monitoring every common area of the house, both inside and out. They record audio and video to an encrypted cloud server 24 hours a day. I would be more than happy to pull up the footage for the past 30 days so you can observe the actual environment my son lives in. The investigators exchanged a look of profound relief. Access to unedited long-term interior security footage is a silver bullet in a child welfare investigation. Yes, please, the lead investigator said, setting the binder down. That would be incredibly helpful in closing this inquiry. I retrieved my laptop from my office and placed it on the coffee table. I logged into the encrypted portal and pulled up the grid of camera feeds. I clicked on the living room and kitchen cameras, scrubbing back through the timeline. I showed them Tuesday evening, where Leo and I were sitting at the kitchen island, laughing while eating spaghetti. I showed them last Saturday morning, capturing us building a massive pillow fort right where they were currently sitting. I showed them a week of calm, mundane, incredibly safe domestic life. But as I scrolled back to a Friday night 2 weeks prior, my finger slipped on the trackpad. I accidentally clicked on a timestamp from 11:30 at night. It was a night I had been forced to stay late at my downtown office to finalize a corporate merger audit. David had been tasked with watching Leo. The video buffered for a second before snapping into crystal clear high definition. The audio kicked in simultaneously. The sound of the front door slamming open was so violently loud, it made the second investigator jump in her seat. On the screen, David stumbled into the foyer. He was heavily intoxicated, his tie loosened, his suit jacket hanging off one shoulder. He swayed dangerously, kicking his expensive leather shoes against the baseboards. He muttered a string of vile, slurred profanities as he bumped into the console table, knocking a heavy brass lamp onto the hardwood floor with a sharp crash. The noise woke Leo. On the camera feed covering the main staircase, my 6-year-old son appeared at the top of the landing. He was clutching his stuffed dinosaur, rubbing his eyes, and crying softly because the loud crash had terrified him in the dark. David turned his head, spotting the small boy on the stairs. Instead of comforting him, David's face twisted into an ugly, aggressive sneer. He pointed a shaking finger up the stairs. "Shut your mouth!" David screamed, his voice raw and hateful on the recording. "Shut up and go back to bed. You are not even my real kid. You are just a burden. I am sick of looking at you." Leo shrank back in terror, his crying hitching into panicked gasps. David did not stop. He marched heavily toward the stairs, grabbing the banister. He aggressively pushed past the crying child, his shoulder knocking Leo hard against the wooden railing. David did not even look back as he stumbled down the hallway and slammed the master bedroom door so hard the camera lens visibly shook. The video continued to roll, showing my tiny, terrified son sitting alone on the dark staircase, sobbing into his stuffed animal for 20 minutes until he finally cried himself to sleep on the steps. I reached out and pressed the space bar to pause the video. My hand was trembling slightly. I had never seen this footage. I had been working to secure a future for our family while the man I married was terrorizing my child in the dark. My heart shattered for my son, but the cold, calculating part of my brain immediately locked onto the tactical advantage David had just handed me on a silver platter. The living room was dead silent. The two CPS investigators stared at the pause screen in absolute, unadulterated disgust. The second investigator raised a hand to her mouth, visibly appalled by the verbal and physical aggression she had just witnessed. Mrs. Harrison, the lead investigator, said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all of its previous bureaucratic detachment. "Was that your husband on the recording?" "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly steady, weaponizing my calm demeanor to highlight the contrast between my stability and David's volatility. "That is David Harrison, the man standing at the end of my driveway right now." The investigators looked toward the front window, realizing that the man who had likely orchestrated this malicious tip was the actual threat to the child. "I want to be perfectly clear with you both," I stated, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. "David Harrison no longer resides in this home. The locks were professionally changed this morning. His belongings are currently sitting in black trash bags on the front porch. I have legally severed his access to this property, and he will never step foot inside this house again. I am the sole protector of my son, and I have removed the only unstable element from our environment." The lead investigator nodded emphatically, furiously writing notes on her clipboard. "You have taken exactly the right steps. The allegations against you are entirely without merit. In fact, based on the documentation you provided and the proactive measures you have taken to secure your home against your husband, we consider you a highly protective parent. We are closing this case immediately. It will be officially logged as unfounded." "Thank you," I said, leaning forward. "However, I need something from you before you leave. I need the official closure report signed and dated today. I also need the formal documentation regarding the nature of the anonymous tip." The second investigator looked up, surprised. "We cannot reveal the identity of the caller." "I do not need you to reveal their identity," I countered smoothly. "I know exactly who called. The people who made that false report are standing at the end of my driveway, waiting for you to drag me out in handcuffs. I need the documentation of the unfounded allegations because I am instructing my legal team to file a formal lawsuit for malicious harassment and defamation against my in-laws. Weaponizing a state child welfare agency to inflict emotional distress during a financial dispute is a severe legal offense, and I intend to prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law." The lead investigator held my gaze for a long moment. She recognized a woman who was not just defending herself, but actively preparing to obliterate her attackers. She ripped a form from her clipboard, signed her name with a sharp flourish, and handed the carbon copy across the table. "You have our full support," she said firmly. "Using our agency for personal retaliation drains resources from children who are in actual life-threatening danger. It is despicable. We will expedite the formal closure letter to your attorney. I stood up, extending my hand. The two women shook it warmly, treating me with profound professional respect. I walked them to the foyer, grabbed their coats, and opened the front door. The crisp afternoon air rushed in. Down at the end of the long driveway, David and Barbara snapped to attention. They eagerly pushed themselves off the hood of their luxury sedan, their eyes wide with anticipation. They were waiting to see the investigators march out with grim faces. They were waiting for me to be broken. Instead, the two CPS investigators walked out onto the porch, turning back to give me a polite, friendly wave goodbye. I stood in the open doorway, projecting absolute, untouchable calm. The investigators walked down the driveway, their faces hardening into masks of professional disgust as they approached David and Barbara. The lead investigator did not break her stride. She simply shot David a look of pure, unfiltered contempt before getting into her state-issued vehicle and driving away. I remained in the doorway, locking eyes with Barbara across the distance of the driveway. Her smug smile had completely vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered panic. The trap she had so carefully laid had just snapped shut on her own son's neck. I raised my hand and gave her a slow, mocking wave, then stepped backward and slammed the heavy front door shut, sealing them outside in the cold. The heavy thud of the front door echoing in the foyer was the sound of a closing chapter. I stood in the quiet warmth of my hallway for a long moment, listening to the muffled, frustrated shouting of my soon-to-be ex-husband through the thick mahogany wood. He and his mother were stranded on the driveway, their malicious trap shattered into pieces. I did not look out the window. I did not gloat. I turned on my heel and walked straight back into the kitchen. Leo was still sitting at the island, holding up a bright green crayon. He proudly showed me a coloring page of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I kissed the top of his head, praising his artwork, and poured him a fresh glass of apple juice. My hands were perfectly steady. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, replaced by a razor-sharp glacial focus. David had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. By weaponizing Child Protective Services against my son, he had forfeited any right to a civil separation. But more importantly, by draining our joint bank accounts that morning, he had officially declared financial warfare. He threw down the gauntlet thinking I was an unarmed civilian. He forgot that I am a heavily armed general in the world of financial combat. I walked back into my home office, locked the door behind me, and sat down in front of my dual monitors. The screensaver vanished, revealing the blank waiting interface of my firm's proprietary auditing software. If David wanted to play with money, we were going to play with money. I cracked my knuckles and began typing. When you are married, your financial lives are legally intertwined, which meant I had lawful, unfettered access to pull years of joint tax filings, shared credit histories, and banking routing numbers without needing a subpoena. I started with the $4,212 he had siphoned from checking and the $15,000 he had stolen from savings that very morning. Tracking those transfers was child's play. The routing numbers pointed to a newly established individual account at a separate regional bank. But that was just the surface-level theft. I am not paid to look at the surface. I am paid to dig into the bedrock. I pulled up the comprehensive historical ledgers for our joint accounts dating back to the exact month we were married. I ran a standard diagnostic algorithm, instructing the software to flag any recurring unexplained outgoing transfers, unusual vendor payments, or cash withdrawals that deviated from our standard household operating budget. I sat back and watched as the progress bar rapidly filled the screen. Within 60 seconds, the algorithm spat out a red-flagged report that made the breath catch in my throat. It was not a few isolated anomalies. It was a massive systematic hemorrhage. Over the past 36 months, David had been executing a textbook case of embezzlement right under my nose. Because I worked 60-hour weeks managing high-profile corporate clients, I had trusted him to handle the day-to-day payment of our household utility bills, landscaping services, and minor maintenance costs out of our joint account. I had funded that account generously with my own salary to ensure he never felt financially stressed. He had taken that trust and weaponized it, The ledger showed hundreds of microtransactions, $200 here, $500 there, $800 routed out on a random Tuesday. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. I highlighted the destination routing numbers. The funds were not going into an investment portfolio or a secret savings account for our future. They were being funneled into 3 distinct Shell Limited liability companies. The vendor names were incredibly generic: Oakbridge Consulting, Summit Property Management, Apex Logistics. To a casual observer or an automated banking flag, they looked like standard boring suburban expenses. But I am not a casual observer. I accessed a commercial public records database and ran the employer identification numbers for all 3 Shell companies. The registered agent for every single one of them was a cheap mail forwarding storefront in Delaware. But the managing director listed on the original incorporation documents was David Harrison. He had set up fake vendor accounts to invoice his own marital checking account, systematically siphoning my hard-earned salary into his private control. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the data streams. Stealing the money was one thing, but I needed to know exactly where the money went after it hit those Shell accounts. I ran a secondary trace on the outbound transfers from the Delaware entities. The money trail split into 2 distinct, devastating paths. The first path led directly to a series of high-interest premium credit card accounts. I cross-referenced the account identifiers. They did not belong to David. They belonged to Courtney, my 30-year-old, incredibly arrogant, chronically unemployed sister-in-law. The same woman who rolled her eyes when her mother slapped my child. I pulled the merchant data associated with Courtney's credit card payments. I sat in the glow of my monitors and watched a horrifying story unfold in alphanumeric code. I had paid for Courtney's life. My brutal, exhausting hours untangling corporate fraud had funded her entire performative social media existence. The thousands of dollars David had stolen from our joint account were explicitly used to pay down Courtney's crippling retail debt. I saw the receipts for imported designer handbags. I saw the charges for luxury ski vacations in Aspen. I saw the recurring monthly payments for her leased top-of-the-line imported sport utility vehicle. Every time Courtney had sneered at my practical work clothes, she was doing it while wearing a designer jacket financed entirely by my paycheck. David had been stealing my money to keep his spoiled sister swimming in unearned luxury. The second path of the stolen money was even more sickening. The remaining outbound transfers from the Shell companies routed directly to the accounts receivable department of the Connecticut Heritage Country Club. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenching so tight my teeth ached. The country club was Barbara's absolute favorite stage. It was where she hosted her elite charity luncheons, drank expensive champagne, and paraded her false generational wealth in front of the local high society. The Harrisons had been bankrupt for a decade. They had defaulted on their estate loan. They had absolutely no liquid capital to maintain their country club membership. The exorbitant monthly dues, the dining minimums, the event hosting fees for Barbara's lavish parties, they were all being paid by me. David was funneling my money through his fake businesses to secretly pay his mother's country club invoices. The woman who looked me in the eye and told my 6-year-old son that he was not real family had been eating caviar bought and paid for by my labor. I ran the final calculation. The software tallied the stolen funds over the course of our 3-year marriage. The final number flashed on the screen in bright, undeniable red font: $284,000. David had stolen over $250,000 from me. I sat alone in my home office, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. The emotional devastation of the betrayal washed over me, cold and absolute. This was not a case of a weak husband making a few bad financial choices to help his struggling family. This was a highly organized, predatory operation. I looked at the timeline of the initial Shell Company incorporation. David had set up Oakbridge Consulting exactly 4 months after we started dating. He incorporated the other 2 companies weeks before our wedding. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. David never loved me. He never looked at Leo and wanted to be a father. He had looked at me and seen a mark. He had seen a financially independent, successful woman who was grieving her late husband and desperate to build a stable family for her child. He knew his family's financial empire was crumbling into dust. He knew his father was bankrupt, and his mother would rather die than lose her social standing. He married me because my high-income career was the perfect oblivious host for a family of financial parasites. He played the loving husband, kissing my cheek when I left for work at 6 in the morning, knowing full well he was going to spend his afternoon wiring my salary to his sister's credit card company. The tears I thought I might shed never came. There was no sorrow left in me. There was only the icy mechanical precision of a woman preparing for absolute war. I opened a new highly encrypted folder on my private server. I titled it Harrison Fraud Discovery. I began meticulously exporting every ledger, every routing number, every fake invoice, and every credit card receipt. I compiled the data into airtight, undeniable exhibits. I built pivot tables demonstrating the exact flow of stolen capital. I gathered enough forensic evidence to not only secure a devastating divorce, but to potentially send my husband to federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. David thought he could ruin my life by draining a checking account and calling Child Protective Services. He was entirely unaware that he had just handed a master forensic auditor the exact map to his own destruction. I backed up the entire dossier to a secure offline drive, slipped it into the safe beneath my desk, and picked up my phone to call my attorney. The Harrisons wanted to play a game of wealth and power. I was going to show them what real power looked like, and I was going to make sure they lost everything. I dialed Thomas, my lead counsel, and briefed him on the financial audit and the unfounded child welfare visit. He was silent for a moment before letting out a low whistle, promising to have a team ready to process the data by morning. I slept soundly that night, the sleep of a woman who held the winning hand. But by Thursday morning, the Harrisons proved that when cornered, they do not surrender. They double down. I was in the kitchen pouring my first cup of coffee when my phone began to vibrate against the granite countertop. It was not a steady buzz, but a relentless, frantic rattling. I unlocked the screen to find an absolute avalanche of notifications. Text messages from distant relatives, missed calls from neighbors, and hundreds of alerts from social media platforms I rarely checked. I opened my messages and watched a wave of digital vitriol flood my screen. How could you do this to David? Read one message from a woman I played tennis with twice a year. I always knew you were cold, but trying to destroy a family that took your son in is purely evil. Read another from one of David's college fraternity brothers. You are sick. Get help before you ruin that poor man's life entirely. I raised an eyebrow, took a sip of my black coffee, and opened the social media application that was generating the most noise. It took exactly 3 seconds to find the source of the digital lynch mob. Courtney had gone live. My 30-year-old chronically unemployed sister-in-law had decided to weaponize her primary asset, her thousands of devoted, oblivious online followers. She had posted a highly produced, heavily filtered 10-minute video titled "Surviving a Narcissist in the Family." I tapped the screen and watched the performance unfold. Courtney was sitting on the grand staircase of the Harrison estate, the very property I now legally owned. She was dressed in a pristine, oversized cashmere sweater, looking appropriately frail and devastated. She had expertly applied her makeup to look as though she had been crying for days, her eyes red-rimmed and her cheeks flushed. The lighting was perfectly staged to cast soft, tragic shadows across her face. I want to talk about something incredibly painful today. Courtney began, her voice trembling, with practiced vulnerability. I usually keep my family life private, but the abuse we are enduring has to be brought into the light. My brother, one of the kindest, most generous men on earth, is being systematically destroyed by the woman he married. She did not use my name, but she used every possible identifying detail. She talked about the gold-digging woman who married into their wealthy family with a child from a previous relationship. She spun a fantastical narrative about how this woman, meaning me, was insanely jealous of their tight-knit family bond. She drained his bank accounts. Courtney choked out, expertly forcing a single tear to roll down her cheek. She locked him out of his own house on a freezing Monday morning. And yesterday she went completely unhinged and tried to attack my mother. We are living in a nightmare. She is a narcissistic, manipulative monster who is trying to tear our perfect family apart just to get her hands on my father's money. I sat at my kitchen island and watched the entire video with the detached clinical fascination of a biologist studying a peculiar insect. The sheer, unadulterated irony of her words was a masterpiece of psychological projection. Courtney was sitting in a house she did not own, claiming I was after her father's money when her father was functionally bankrupt. She was crying about me draining David's accounts when David had actually drained my decoy funds in a failed ambush. But the absolute crowning jewel of the video, the detail that actually made me laugh out loud in my quiet kitchen, was her outfit. I recognized the cashmere sweater she was wearing. I recognized the designer watch glinting on her wrist as she dramatically wiped away her fake tears. I had seen the exact itemized receipts for those luxury goods in my forensic audit the night before. They had been purchased using the shell companies David created. Courtney was sitting on the internet calling me a gold digger, while literally wearing garments financed by the money stolen from my paychecks. The comment section beneath the video was a cesspool of outrage. Thousands of strangers were offering Courtney their prayers and demanding justice for her poor, victimized brother. Mutual acquaintances were tagging each other, expressing their shock and horror at my supposedly vile behavior. The social pressure was designed to be suffocating. This is the modern equivalent of a public stoning. The Harrisons knew they had failed to break me privately, so they decided to publicly humiliate me into submission. They believed that the sheer volume of societal backlash would shame me into unlocking the doors, handing over my money, and begging for their forgiveness to clear my name. My phone rang. It was Thomas, my attorney. "Have you seen it?" he asked, his voice tight with professional concern. "My paralegals just flagged a massive spike in digital traffic mentioning your husband's family." "I am watching it right now," I replied cheerfully. "It is a very compelling performance. I think she missed her calling in soap operas." Thomas let out a heavy breath. "Melanie, this is a highly coordinated defamation campaign. The narrative is spreading fast. We need to draft a cease and desist letter immediately. I can have a public relations firm issue a counterstatement by noon to mitigate the reputational damage." "Absolutely not," I instructed, my voice hardening into absolute authority. "I will not engage in a public shouting match with a 30-year-old woman who relies on stolen funds to pay her cellular bill. Silence is the only response she gets from me." "But the reputational damage," Thomas warned. "Let them talk," I said. "Let them rally their flying monkeys. Let David and Barbara believe they are winning the public relations war. When you are fighting a loud, desperate enemy, the worst thing you can do is interrupt them while they are making a mistake. I want you to give your paralegal team a very specific directive." I stood up and began pacing the hardwood floor of my kitchen, my mind racing with legal strategy. "I do not want a single word of defense posted online. Instead, I want your team to archive every single thing Courtney posts. Download the raw video files. Capture the metadata. Screenshot every comment where she agrees with a defamatory statement. Archive the messages I am receiving from third parties as proof of reputational harm and emotional distress. I want a certified, time-stamped digital record of this entire smear campaign." Thomas caught on immediately, his tone shifting from concerned to predatory. "You want to turn her social media account into a designated evidence locker." "Exactly," I confirmed. "Courtney thinks she is winning the court of public opinion. She does not realize she is meticulously documenting her own liability for a massive defamation and cyber harassment lawsuit. Every tear she sheds on camera is another nail in their legal coffin. Let her keep digging." I hung up the phone and walked over to the kitchen window. The suburban street was quiet, entirely disconnected from the digital hurricane raging on my phone. My notifications continued to buzz, a relentless drumbeat of manufactured outrage. I went into my phone settings and calmly turned off all notifications for my social media applications. I muted the text threads from the gullible neighbors and distant relatives who had taken Courtney's bait. The silence returned to my kitchen, heavy and peaceful. I knew exactly what the Harrisons were doing. The child welfare ambush had failed spectacularly. The financial blockade had failed. This social media circus was their desperate, flailing attempt to regain control. By painting me as the villain, David was justifying his next move to the public. He was building a narrative where he was the brave, beleaguered husband escaping a toxic, abusive wife. He was going to use this wave of internet sympathy to strike at me legally. He would feel completely emboldened by the thousands of strangers telling him he was a victim. He would march into a lawyer's office puffed up with unearned confidence and demand the world. I smiled at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. Let him come. I had the encrypted drive sitting in my safe. I had the security footage. I had the deed to his mother's house. The Harrisons were bringing a smartphone to a financial slaughter. I poured my coffee into a travel mug, gathered my briefcase, and headed out the door to drop Leo at school before heading to my office. The digital noise meant nothing. The only thing that mattered now was the cold, inescapable reality of the legal system, and I was going to leverage it to burn their illusions to the ground. My downtown corporate office is a fortress of glass steel and absolute productivity. Perched on the 42nd floor of a high-rise, it offers a sweeping panoramic view of the city skyline. It is a daily physical reminder of the empire I have built entirely from the ground up with my own intellect and relentless work ethic. Thursday morning was proceeding with the clinical efficiency I demand from my team. I was in the middle of a high-stakes strategy meeting with 3 senior partners, actively dissecting the financial liabilities of an impending corporate merger, when the heavy glass door to my conference room swung open. My executive assistant, a highly competent woman who rarely loses her composure, stood in the doorway looking visibly distressed. Behind her loomed a large, broad-shouldered man in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit. He carried a thick manila envelope in his right hand. He did not wait to be announced or invited inside. He pushed past my assistant, stepping directly into the center of my boardroom. "Melanie Harrison," he announced. His voice boomed across the polished mahogany table, deliberately loud enough to carry through the open door and out into the bustling bullpen of junior accountants and administrative staff. "You have been served." He slammed the thick envelope down onto the table right on top of my confidential merger documents. This was a calculated, highly orchestrated ambush. Process servers typically operate with a degree of professional discretion, approaching a target privately or waiting outside a personal residence. Breaching a secured corporate high-rise, bypassing reception, and interrupting an executive board meeting required a specific level of aggressive, malicious coordination. David had planned this. Emboldened by the fabricated outrage of his sister Courtney's social media campaign and the blind, arrogant support of his bankrupt parents, he wanted to humiliate me in front of my peers. He envisioned me breaking down sobbing hysterically in my tailored suit while my colleagues watched my personal life implode on a public stage. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with the man in the cheap suit. I simply nodded to my senior partners. "Gentlemen, let us take a 5-minute recess." They filed out of the room silently, their professional discretion completely intact, leaving me alone with the process server. I picked up the heavy manila envelope. The paper was thick, the legal seal of the county family court stamped aggressively across the front. I slid my silver letter opener under the flap and pulled out the divorce petition. David had hired a notoriously aggressive, overpriced bulldog of a family lawyer, no doubt paying the massive retainer fee with the funds he had stolen from my decoy checking account earlier in the week. The petition was an absolute masterclass in narcissistic delusion. I scanned the pages, my forensic eyes immediately jumping past the standard legal boilerplate and zeroing in on the specific demands. The sheer audacity on display was breathtaking. First, David was petitioning the court for full sole legal and physical custody of Leo. My blood ran cold, but my face remained an impassive mask of stone. David had zero biological connection to my son. He had spent the last 3 years actively ignoring the boy, culminating in the drunken, abusive tirade captured on my home security cameras. He did not want custody because he loved Leo or possessed a single paternal instinct. He wanted custody to use my child as a human shield and a weapon of mass emotional destruction. It was a spiteful, vindictive maneuver designed entirely to force me into a panicked, desperate surrender. Second were the financial demands. David was requesting permanent, exorbitant spousal support. His lawyer had painted a tragic, highly fictionalized narrative of a supportive, selfless husband who had sacrificed his own career trajectory and earning potential to maintain our household, thereby allowing me to build my wealth. He was asking the court for half of the equity in my forensic accounting firm. He was demanding exclusive possession of the suburban house I had purchased with my own money before we even met. But the final, absolute crowning jewel of his legal delusion was buried deeply on page 12 of the document. His lawyer formally accused me of financial infidelity. The petition explicitly claimed I had been systematically hiding assets from the marital estate to defraud my husband. They were requesting a court-ordered full-scale forensic audit of my personal and professional accounts. I actually let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound echoed brightly off the glass walls of the conference room. The process server who was lingering by the door, clearly expecting tears screaming or a dramatic collapse, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He looked entirely confused by my genuine amusement. David, a man who had left a digital paper trail a mile wide while actively embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay his sister's credit card bills and his mother's country club dues, was demanding a forensic audit. He was eagerly inviting the court to point a massive magnifying glass at our finances, completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing squarely on a trapdoor. He thought his shell companies and regional bank accounts were clever maneuvers. He was bringing a plastic water gun to a nuclear launch site. "Are we finished here?" I asked the process server, keeping my voice light and entirely conversational. He blinked, clearly thrown completely off his script. "Yes, ma'am. You have been legally served. Your formal response is required within 20 days. I picked up a sleek fountain pen from my desk, signed the acknowledgement of service with a fluid, perfectly steady hand, and handed the yellow carbon receipt back to him. "Thank you for your prompt delivery," I said pleasantly. "You know the way to the elevators." He practically sprinted out of the office, clearly eager to escape the unnerving, icy calm of the room. I stood alone in the boardroom, my hands resting flat on the cool mahogany table. The social media campaign, the malicious Child Protective Services visit, and now these aggressively delusional divorce papers. David and his entire family were operating under the arrogant assumption that I would eventually crack under the mounting pressure. They thought applying maximum social, emotional, and legal leverage would force me to negotiate to hand over my hard-earned wealth and to beg for my son's safety. They thought they were the apex predators, and I was just the prey. They had no idea that they were simply running out of runway. I picked up my mobile phone and pressed the speed dial for Thomas, my personal lead counsel. He answered on the very first ring. "We have incoming fire," I stated, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looking down at the crawling city traffic far below. I was just served with a formal divorce petition right in the middle of a board meeting. David is requesting full sole custody of Leo. He wants permanent alimony, and he has formally accused me of hiding marital assets. I heard Thomas let out a dry, incredulous chuckle over the secure line. "He is accusing you of hiding assets. That is incredibly bold for a man whose massive embezzlement file is currently sitting fully encrypted on my desk. How do you want to handle the initial response?" "I do not want to respond to his petition yet," I instructed, my voice dropping into a register of absolute uncompromising authority. "Let his lawyer strut around downtown thinking they have the upper hand. Let David puff his chest out and brag to his mother about how he put me in my place. We are not going to fight him on his terms. We are going to change the entire battlefield." "What is the exact directive?" Thomas asked, his tone instantly shifting into tactical combat mode. "The grace period is officially over," I said. "I want you to initiate the asset unmasking protocol immediately. Contact the managing directors of my blind limited liability company. Instruct them to execute the legal transfer of the Harrison estate deed right now. I want that property stripped entirely out of the anonymous LLC and transferred directly into my personal name." Thomas paused for a fraction of a second, processing the sheer magnitude and brutality of the order. "Once that deed is recorded in the county clerk's office, it becomes accessible public record. Barbara and William will be formally notified by the county that the distressed debt they defaulted on has changed hands. The entire illusion ends today." "That is exactly the point," I confirmed, staring at my reflection in the glass window. David thinks he can intimidate me by threatening my son and trying to lay claim to my business. He thinks he is playing a sophisticated game of chess. I am flipping the entire board over. The Harrisons have been living on borrowed time and my stolen money for a decade. It is time to collect the debt. Consider it done, Thomas said with grim satisfaction. The county clerk will have the official transfer documents within the hour. The property will be legally yours in name by the end of the business day. I ended the call and slipped the mobile phone back into my pocket. I looked down at the ridiculous divorce papers sitting on the conference table. David wanted to take everything from me. He wanted to strip me of my child, my home, and my dignity just to protect his mother's fragile ego. He was about to learn a devastating lesson. When you declare war on a woman who holds the mortgage to your entire family's existence, you do not walk away with a lucrative settlement. You walk away with absolutely nothing. I straightened my suit jacket, gathered my merger documents, and walked out of the conference room to resume my meeting. The legal demolition had been authorized. 14 days after the process server breached my corporate boardroom, the mandatory legal mediation session commenced. The venue was a neutral arbitration firm located in the heart of the financial district. The designated room was a sterile glass-walled conference space on the 20th floor. The environment was intentionally stripped of any warmth, featuring stark white walls, a massive frosted glass table, and aggressive overhead fluorescent lighting that washed all color from the room. The air conditioning hummed with a low, constant vibration, keeping the temperature uncomfortably cold. I sat on the left side of the table. Next to me sat Thomas, my lead counsel, projecting the relaxed, predatory calm of a veteran litigator who already knows the verdict before the trial begins. A certified court reporter sat quietly in the corner, her hands resting lightly on her stenography machine, ready to immortalize every syllable spoken. Directly across the frosted glass table sat the opposition. David looked exactly like a man who was eagerly anticipating spending settlement money he did not yet possess. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that I had purchased for him the previous Christmas. He leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair, exuding an air of unearned, arrogant invincibility. Sitting immediately to his right was his attorney, a notoriously aggressive litigator named Richard. Richard possessed a reputation for utilizing predatory scorched-earth divorce tactics to secure massive payouts for his clients, but the absolute height of absurdity was the woman sitting to David's left. Barbara Harrison had somehow insisted on attending a legally mandated mediation session between her adult son and his wife. She had zero legal standing to be in this room, but David had undoubtedly whined and complained to his attorney until they secured permission for her to attend as a designated support person. In reality, Barbara was not there to offer emotional support. She was there for front-row tickets to my execution. She wore a bright, canary yellow designer blazer and her signature strand of pearls. Her face was arranged into a rigid mask of triumphant condescension. She wanted to watch me break. She wanted to witness the exact moment I surrendered my wealth and begged for mercy. The appointed mediator, a weary-looking former civil judge, initiated the session by reading the standard legal disclaimers. He then gestured to Richard, inviting David's legal counsel to formally present their initial settlement offer. Richard opened a thick, genuine leather binder, cleared his throat loudly, and began listing demands that bordered on absolute comedic delusion. I kept my face entirely blank, treating his words as nothing more than background noise. First, Richard reiterated the demand for full sole legal and physical custody of Leo. He spoke at length about how my demanding career as a managing partner created an environment of severe neglect. He completely ignored the fundamental reality that my demanding career had single-handedly funded every single aspect of their opulent lifestyle for 3 years. He claimed David was the primary emotional provider for the child, a statement so detached from reality it barely warranted a response. Next came the financial extortion. David formally requested 60% of all equity in my forensic accounting firm. Richard argued that my business was a marital asset, claiming David had actively supported my professional trajectory by sacrificing his own career to manage our household. David had never managed a single household task, nor had he sacrificed anything other than my trust. But the lawyer presented the lie with absolute conviction. David also requested $10,000 a month in permanent spousal support to maintain the standard of living he had grown accustomed to. He demanded exclusive permanent possession of the suburban home I had purchased entirely with my own premarital funds long before we even met. Then Richard slid a single printed document across the frosted glass table toward Thomas. It was a drafted non-disparagement agreement containing a highly specific, highly vindictive addendum. David and Barbara were officially demanding that I post a public video apology on all of my personal and professional social media channels, strictly utilizing a script they had provided. I glanced down at the paper resting on the table. The mandated script required me to publicly confess that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown during Thanksgiving dinner. It required me to state that my accusations of abuse against the Harrison family were entirely false. Finally, it demanded that I apologize for causing severe emotional distress to Barbara Harrison and her wonderful, supportive family. I looked across the table. Barbara was practically vibrating in her chair with smug satisfaction. She tapped her manicured fingernails against the glass surface, offering me a patronizing, pitying smile. This was her ultimate goal. She wanted total public humiliation. She wanted to subjugate me, destroy my professional reputation, and force me to bow before her social circle. Thomas and I employed a tactical strategy we had perfected over years of ruthless corporate negotiations: absolute, unnerving, unbroken silence. We did not interrupt Richard's ridiculous speech. We did not object to the absurd financial demands. We did not react to the insulting apology script. We simply sat perfectly still and let the silence stretch out across the room. Silence is an incredibly powerful weapon against narcissists. When you give arrogant people dead, unresponsive silence, their inflated egos cannot handle the vacuum. The lack of validation makes them deeply uncomfortable. They feel a burning, frantic compulsion to fill the empty space with their own voices. They inevitably start talking to justify themselves, and when they talk, they hand you ammunition. The quiet dragged on for a full 60 seconds. The mediator shifted uncomfortably. Richard frowned, clearly expecting Thomas to immediately launch a fiery counter-argument. David, thoroughly unnerved by my complete lack of a reaction, finally broke the silence. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the table, eager to justify his ridiculous terms directly to me. "You have to understand, Melanie," David said, adopting a sickeningly fake tone of sympathetic reason. "You forced my hand here. You locked me out of the house. You left me with absolutely nothing on a Monday morning. I had to secure my financial future. You brought this entirely on yourself." Thomas finally spoke. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, operating with the cold precision of a scalpel. "Let the record show we are currently discussing the unilateral withdrawal of funds from the joint marital accounts. Mr. Harrison, are you formally confirming on the record that on Monday the 12th, you personally authorized the transfer of $19,212 from the joint marital accounts into an external banking account solely under your name?" Richard, realizing instantly that his client was walking into a trap, reached out and grabbed David's forearm. "I advise my client not to answer that question," Richard said quickly. But David's ego was far too massive to listen to legal counsel. He swatted his lawyer's hand away, scoffing loudly as if Thomas had asked a fundamentally stupid question. He wanted to brag. He wanted to show me how smart he was. "Of course I did," David stated proudly, looking directly at the court reporter to ensure she captured his defiance. "It was my right as the head of the household. She was acting erratically. I needed to protect our liquid assets before her paranoia drained us completely. I was just securing the capital that rightfully belongs to me." Barbara could not resist the overwhelming urge to jump into the spotlight to validate her golden boy. "It was the only responsible thing to do," she announced to the mediator, her voice loud and incredibly haughty. She threw his belongings onto the porch in garbage bags like an absolute lunatic. My son had to protect himself from her targeted financial abuse. We advised him to move the marital funds immediately for his own safety. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenography machine, immortalizing every single arrogant word. I kept my face entirely blank, betraying absolutely nothing. But internally, I was orchestrating a magnificent symphony of victory. David had just gone on the official legal record actively admitting to the premeditated unilateral draining of marital funds. He had explicitly stated his intention to deprive me of capital. Even better, Barbara had just placed herself on the official record as a consulting party to the financial theft, admitting she advised the embezzlement. They had just gift-wrapped a documented sworn confession to financial abuse and handed it directly to a managing partner of a forensic accounting firm. The mediator looked over at Thomas, waiting for our formal counteroffer. Thomas casually closed his leather notepad, capped his fountain pen, and folded his hands on the table. "We decline all terms presented today," Thomas stated flatly, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "We will not be surrendering a single percentage of business equity. We will not be paying any spousal support. We will absolutely not be negotiating custody of a child my client is fully capable of protecting from documented harm. And we certainly will not be issuing any public apologies to anyone sitting on that side of the table." Richard bristled, his face reddening with anger. He leaned aggressively over the frosted glass. "If you refuse to mediate in good faith, we will immediately take this to trial. We will rip your client's finances apart in discovery. We will hire our own auditors and find exactly what she is hiding from the marital estate. You are making a massive mistake." Thomas stood up smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket with an air of absolute terrifying finality. "We welcome a trial, Counselor," Thomas replied smoothly. "In fact, we are very much looking forward to the financial discovery phase. I suspect the formal audit will be very interesting for the Harrisons." "Highly illuminating." David smirked, completely misinterpreting Thomas's calm demeanor. He fully believed he had just intimidated us into a corner. Barbara stood up, smoothing her yellow blazer, casting a look of pure victorious disgust in my direction. They gathered their thick legal binders and marched proudly out of the glass-walled conference room, their heads held incredibly high. They walked toward the elevators feeling like absolute conquerors who had just won a war. They were entirely unaware that the massive steel jaws of the trap had just clicked shut right around their ankles. The 30-day grace period on the Harrison estate's defaulted private equity loan officially expired at exactly midnight on a Tuesday. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my home office watching the digital clock on my secondary monitor tick over from 11:59 to midnight. At 8 o'clock the following morning, my legal team electronically filed the final deed transfer documents with the county clerk's office. The transaction was processed, recorded, and finalized within 2 hours. The property, the sprawling Connecticut mansion that the Harrisons used as the very foundation of their elitist identity, now belonged entirely to my limited liability company. I did not execute the eviction immediately. I am not a woman who strikes randomly. I am a woman who strikes with maximum tactical efficiency. I accessed the digital calendar David had previously shared with me, checking the dates for the upcoming week. I found exactly what I was looking for. That Friday, Barbara Harrison was scheduled to host her highly anticipated exclusive monthly charity luncheon. It was the absolute pinnacle of her social calendar. She had invited 30 of Connecticut's wealthiest, most influential socialites to the estate. These were the women she desperately needed to impress. These were the women who validated her entire existence. They were going to arrive in their luxury vehicles, drink expensive champagne, and marvel at the grandeur of the Harrison home. It was the perfect stage. On Friday morning, I drove to my downtown office, dressed in a sharp, slate gray suit. I reviewed the final legal paperwork with Thomas. The eviction notice was drafted perfectly. Because the property had changed hands due to a commercial loan default, and because the previous owners had already missed the required 30-day grace period, standard residential tenant laws did not apply in the same manner. They were legally classified as holdover occupants on a commercial asset. We had secured a highly expedited 7-day notice to vacate the premises. Furthermore, I had provided the local sheriff's department with the security footage of David's drunken violent outburst, alongside the documented history of Barbara's physical assault against my son at Thanksgiving. Based on the proven volatility and the potential for a hostile reaction, the department agreed to authorize a civil standby. They dispatched 2 uniformed officers to accompany the process servers. At exactly 1:30 in the afternoon, right when Barbara's luncheon would be hitting its peak, I sat back in my office chair and gave Thomas the green light. "Execute," I instructed quietly. Miles away in the wealthy Connecticut suburbs, the scene unfolded exactly as I had choreographed it. I received the real-time updates from the lead process server via encrypted text message. Barbara's luncheon was in full swing in the grand solarium of the estate. 30 women in designer dresses were sipping mimosas and eating catered finger sandwiches. Barbara was standing at the head of the long table, likely giving a pretentious speech about her family's long-standing philanthropic legacy. The heavy imported oak front doors of the estate were not knocked upon. They were opened by the caterers, who were actively bringing in dessert trays. 2 broad-shouldered process servers dressed in immaculate dark suits walked straight into the grand foyer. Behind them walked 2 fully uniformed county sheriff's deputies, their radios crackling softly in the quiet, opulent hallway. The sudden, authoritative presence of law enforcement instantly shattered the refined atmosphere of the luncheon. The polite chatter of the 30 socialites died instantly. Barbara froze mid-sentence. She stared at the officers, her face flushing with immediate defensive indignation. "Excuse me," Barbara demanded, her voice echoing shrilly across the solarium. "What is the meaning of this? You are interrupting a private charity event. Who let you in here?" The lead process server stepped forward, bypassing the confused caterers. He did not raise his voice. He did not match her hysterical energy. He spoke with the loud, clear, projecting tone of a man delivering a legal mandate in a crowded room. "Barbara Harrison," he announced, confirming her identity. "Yes, that is me," she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "I demand you leave my property immediately before I call the chief of police." "You have been legally served," the process server stated, ignoring her threat entirely. He extended a thick, bright yellow envelope, pressing it directly into her chest until she was forced to take it to keep it from falling. "This is a formal court-ordered 7-day notice of eviction." The server continued, his voice carrying clearly to every single woman sitting at the dining table. "The property located at this address has been formally seized due to a commercial loan default. The deed has been legally transferred. You and all current occupants have exactly 7 days to vacate the premises, or you will be physically removed by law enforcement for trespassing on private property." The solarium was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the crystal water glasses. 30 of Connecticut's most elite, judgmental women sat perfectly still, their eyes darting between the uniformed officers and Barbara's rapidly paling face. "This is a mistake," Barbara stammered, her voice dropping an octave, the sheer panic finally bleeding through her arrogant facade. "This is my house. We own this estate. There is no default. This is an administrative error." The process server shook his head. "There is no error, ma'am. The property is now legally owned in its entirety by Vanguard Asset Holdings, LLC. The transfer was recorded and finalized with the county clerk on Wednesday morning." Barbara ripped open the yellow envelope with trembling fingers. She pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. Her eyes scanned the first page. She saw the seal of the county court. She saw the undeniable, terrifyingly real language of a commercial foreclosure. And then her eyes hit the bottom of the page where the managing director of Vanguard Asset Holdings, LLC, was listed in bold black ink. Melanie Harrison. The color drained from Barbara's face so fast, I am surprised she did not faint. She looked like a woman who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. She stared at my name, the name of the woman she had dismissed, insulted and assaulted, printed legally, as the sole owner of the very ground she was standing on. She did not say a word. She could not. Her throat worked silently as she stared at the paper. The 30 socialites watching the exchange were not fools. They were women who understood the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of high society wealth. They understood instantly what an eviction notice accompanied by law enforcement meant. It meant the Harrison money was gone. It meant the Harrison legacy was a lie. It meant Barbara was bankrupt and her entire life was a pathetic, carefully constructed illusion. One by one, the women began to stand up. They did not offer their sympathies. They did not ask if they could help. In the cutthroat world of elite social circles, financial ruin is highly contagious. They wanted to get as far away from the blast radius as possible. They gathered their expensive handbags, offered tight, uncomfortable smiles to the room at large, and began a rapid, silent exodus toward the front door. Barbara stood frozen in the center of the solarium, clutching the bright yellow eviction notice to her chest, watching her entire social standing evaporate in less than 3 minutes. The women she had spent decades trying to impress were fleeing her home like it was a sinking ship. She was exposed, humiliated, and utterly destroyed. The process server texted me the final update: documents delivered, target secured, premises clearing out. I sat back in my office chair and took a slow, deep breath. The first major pillar of the Harrison empire had just been demolished. The public humiliation was absolute. But I was not finished. The eviction was just the opening salvo. It was time to execute the financial squeeze. The silence inside the Harrison estate was absolute. It was the kind of suffocating quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion. The 30 elite socialites had vanished down the sweeping driveway, leaving behind untouched mimosa glasses and a dining room full of cold, expensive appetizers. Barbara stood alone in the center of the grand solarium, her hands trembling violently as she clutched the bright yellow eviction notice. The crisp legal paper felt incredibly heavy. Within 20 minutes, the heavy front doors banged open. David and Courtney had rushed over the moment Barbara frantically called them, her voice cracking with hysterical panic. They found their mother collapsed into a velvet armchair, staring blankly at the marble floor. William stood by the window, his shoulders slumped, his posture devoid of the aristocratic arrogance he had carried for decades. "This is a forgery," David declared, immediately snatching the legal documents from his mother's hands. His eyes darted across the text, refusing to comprehend the reality of the court seal. "Melanie is trying to intimidate us. She is playing some kind of sick psychological game. I will call Richard right now. We will have her arrested for fabricating legal documents." David reached for his phone, but William finally turned away from the window. His voice was incredibly hollow, stripped of all its usual booming authority. "Put the phone away, David." William said, his tone heavy with absolute defeat. "It is not a forgery. She is not bluffing. She owns the house." The entire room froze. Courtney, who had been aggressively typing a new social media update on her phone, stopped entirely. David lowered his device, staring at his father in total disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Barbara demanded, her voice rising to a shrill, panicked pitch. "William, tell them this is a mistake. Tell them our financial portfolio is perfectly secure. We have generational wealth. We are Harrisons. We have absolutely nothing." William confessed, the words dropping like lead weights onto the marble floor. "We have not had a single cent of actual wealth for 10 years, Barbara." The dam finally broke. William stood in the center of the solarium and confessed to a decade of profound, terrifying financial deception. He detailed the disastrous commercial real estate venture that wiped out his inheritance. He admitted to leveraging the estate through a predatory private equity firm just to keep up appearances, to keep paying Barbara's country club dues, and to keep fueling the illusion that they were untouchable elites. He confessed to missing the final payments, knowing the foreclosure was looming, but hiding it out of pure cowardly vanity. So Melanie bought the debt. David whispered, the horrifying realization crashing over him. He sank onto the edge of the sofa, his hands gripping his hair. "My wife bought the distressed loan. She possesses the deed. She holds the entire mortgage." Courtney let out a piercing, dramatic shriek. "What about my inheritance? What about my trust fund? You promised me a trust fund." "There is no trust fund." Courtney Williams snapped, his patience finally breaking under the weight of his daughter's relentless entitlement. "There is nothing. We are completely bankrupt. We have exactly 7 days to pack our belongings and vacate this property before the sheriff physically removes us." David stared at the floor, his mind spinning wildly. He had just served divorce papers demanding exclusive possession of an estate that his wife already legally owned. He had demanded alimony from a woman who held the absolute power to render his entire family homeless. He had drained a $4,000 checking account, thinking he was financially crippling a titan, completely unaware that she had been holding the keys to his entire existence. While the Harrisons were experiencing their total internal collapse, I was sitting comfortably in the private chambers of a family court judge in downtown Hartford. Thomas sat beside me looking perfectly at ease. We were executing an emergency ex parte, hearing a legal maneuver designed for situations where giving the opposing party advance notice would result in the immediate destruction or hiding of assets. I handed the judge the thick leather-bound binder containing my complete forensic audit. I did not need to make an emotional plea. The numbers spoke for themselves. Your Honor, Thomas stated calmly, maintaining his sharp professional demeanor. We are presenting undeniable documented evidence of severe financial fraud and the ongoing dissipation of marital assets. The respondent, David Harrison, has systematically embezzled over $280,000 from joint marital accounts over the past 36 months. He has utilized a network of fraudulent shell companies to siphon my client's income to fund his sister's personal credit card debt and his mother's private club memberships. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience in financial litigation, adjusted her reading glasses and reviewed the pivot tables, the routed transfer logs, and the incorporation documents of David's fake vendors. She cross-referenced the dates, the amounts, and the undeniable digital footprint David had carelessly left behind. She looked at the emergency injunction request resting on her desk. "This is incredibly brazen." The judge noted, her tone laced with professional disgust. The respondent has effectively set up a money laundering operation within his own marriage. Furthermore, Thomas added smoothly, we have documented proof that on Monday morning the respondent drained the remaining balances of the joint accounts in a retaliatory strike after my client secured the marital home against him. If his personal accounts are not immediately frozen, we have absolute reason to believe he will continue to hide these stolen funds to avoid equitable distribution and repayment. The judge did not hesitate. She picked up her pen and signed the emergency order with a sharp, definitive flourish. The court grants the immediate and total freeze of all individual financial accounts, investment portfolios, and lines of credit held by David Harrison. This freeze is effective immediately and will remain in place until the formal financial discovery hearing. Thomas and I walked out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air. The legal strike was executed flawlessly. It was the ultimate inescapable financial squeeze. At that exact moment, miles away in the Harrison estate, David pulled out his smartphone. Panicked by his father's confession, he opened his banking application, desperately intending to transfer the stolen marital funds to a secure offshore account he had hurriedly set up. He typed in his password. The screen loaded. A bright red error banner flashed across his display. Account locked. Please contact your financial institution's legal compliance department. David's heart stopped. He frantically tried his secondary savings account. Locked. He tried his primary credit card. Suspended. He tried the business accounts for his fraudulent shell companies. Frozen. The digital doors had violently slammed shut. He was completely, irrevocably cut off from every single cent he possessed. He was staring at financial zero. The immediate consequences of that freeze did not take long to manifest. The following afternoon, Courtney decided to cope with the crushing stress of her impending homelessness the only way she knew how. She went shopping. She drove her pristine leased white luxury SUV to the most exclusive outdoor shopping promenade in the state. She was in heavy denial, fully believing that David would somehow fix the mess, hire a better lawyer, and restore their infinite cash flow. She spent 3 hours inside a high-end boutique, blindly trying to self-soothe by purchasing designer boots and cashmere scarves. Courtney confidently approached the checkout counter, dropping her platinum credit card onto the glass surface. The cashier swiped it. The machine beeped harshly. Declined. Courtney scoffed, assuming it was a simple fraud alert. She handed the cashier a second card. Declined. She tried a third. Declined. Her face flushed bright red as the customers behind her in line began to shift impatiently. Humiliated and furious, Courtney abandoned the clothes on the counter and marched out of the boutique, dialing David's number to scream at him for forgetting to pay her bills. As she stormed out into the sunlit parking lot, she stopped dead in her tracks. A heavy-duty industrial tow truck was currently backing up to her pristine white SUV. A man in a high-visibility vest was quickly and efficiently securing heavy metal hooks around her front tires. "What are you doing?" Courtney shrieked, dropping her phone and sprinting across the asphalt. "Take your hands off my vehicle right now. Do you have any idea who I am?" The tow truck driver did not flinch. He was entirely accustomed to wealthy people throwing public temper tantrums. He calmly pulled a clipboard from his belt and checked the vehicle identification number. "I am executing a legal repossession order, miss," the driver stated loudly, completely unbothered by her screaming. "This vehicle is 90 days behind on lease payments. The automatic electronic transfer initiated by your guarantor yesterday morning was rejected due to a hard legal freeze on the funding account. I am taking the car." "This is a mistake!" Courtney yelled, her voice echoing across the busy shopping center parking lot. "My brother pays for this car. His accounts are fine. Let me give you a different credit card right now." She frantically dug into her designer purse, shoving the same declined plastic cards toward the driver. The driver simply shook his head, hit a lever on the side of his truck, and engaged the hydraulic lift. "Your accounts are frozen, miss," the driver replied, hopping up into the cab of his truck. "You need to contact your bank. Have a nice day." Courtney stood helplessly in the middle of the crowded parking lot as her luxury SUV was hoisted into the air. Pedestrians were stopping to watch the spectacle. Several teenagers had pulled out their smartphones and were actively recording her public meltdown. The exact same digital weapon Courtney had tried to use to destroy my reputation was now capturing her absolute humiliation in high definition. She screamed. She stomped her feet. She sobbed hysterically. But the tow truck pulled smoothly out of the parking lot, merging into the afternoon traffic, taking the ultimate symbol of her fake stolen wealth away forever. Courtney Harrison was left standing alone on the asphalt, holding useless pieces of plastic. The illusion was completely shattered. The money was gone. The car was gone. The estate was gone. The dominoes were falling with magnificent, terrifying speed, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the crash. The weekend passed with the quiet, efficient hum of total victory. By Monday morning, the reality of the Harrison family's absolute destitution had fully settled into their bones. They had no home, no vehicles, no liquid assets, and absolutely no social standing left to leverage. I was back at my desk on the 42nd floor reviewing a quarterly risk assessment for a new corporate client. The storm I had unleashed was raging miles away, or so I thought. At precisely 10 in the morning, my office phone chimed. My executive assistant spoke through the intercom, her usually crisp voice laced with deep uncertainty. She told me that a woman claiming to be my mother-in-law was currently in the lobby. My assistant explained that the woman did not have an appointment, was completely ignoring the security protocols, and was begging to speak with me. She noted that the woman was crying hysterically and refusing to leave the reception area. I leaned back in my leather chair, processing the information. Barbara Harrison, the woman who had spent the last 3 years treating downtown corporate offices as if they were beneath her aristocratic pedigree, had traveled all the way to my firm. She had willingly walked into the heart of my empire. A week ago, she would have stormed past the reception desk, screaming demands and throwing her weight around. Today, she was weeping in a corporate lobby. I instructed my assistant to send her in, but I also pressed a discreet button under my desk to alert building security to stand by outside my door. When the heavy glass door to my office slowly pushed open, I barely recognized the woman standing on the threshold. The transformation was staggering. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch who had presided over Thanksgiving dinner was entirely gone. In her place stood a broken, terrified, and profoundly aged woman. Barbara wore a wrinkled beige trench coat that looked as though it had been slept in. Her signature pearls were missing. Her hair, usually sprayed into a perfect, immovable helmet, hung limply around her face. She wore no makeup, revealing the deep, exhausted lines around her eyes and mouth. Her hands were shaking violently as she clutched a crumpled tissue. She stepped into my spacious office, her eyes darting nervously around the room, taking in the panoramic skyline view, the modern art, the undeniable proof of my authority. She looked like a peasant who had wandered into a throne room. "Melanie," she whimpered, her voice cracking as she took another hesitant step forward. "Please, you have to listen to me." I did not stand up. I did not offer her a seat. I remained perfectly still behind my massive mahogany desk, my hands folded, resting on top of a financial dossier. I looked at her with the exact same cold, analytical detachment I used to examine a fraudulent tax return. "You have exactly 3 minutes to explain why you are trespassing in my place of business," I stated evenly. Barbara let out a loud, pathetic sob and rushed forward, pressing her hands flat against the edge of my desk. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. The superiority was entirely vaporized, replaced by a desperate, nauseating submission. "You have to stop this!" she cried, tears spilling over her cheeks and dripping onto the polished wood. "We are losing everything. The eviction notice, the frozen accounts, Courtney's car. It is all gone. We have nowhere to go. We have no money for food. You are destroying us." "I am not destroying anything," I replied smoothly. "I am simply auditing the reality you created. You spent a decade living on stolen time and defaulted loans. I just balanced the ledger." Barbara shook her head frantically, her wet hair clinging to her face. She realized her aggressive tactics had failed, so she instantly pivoted to the only strategy she had left. She played the victim. "It was not my fault," she gasped, leaning closer. "You have to believe me, Melanie. I did not know. William lied to me. He lied to all of us. He told me the investments were secure. He told me the estate was fully paid off. He kept me completely in the dark about the bankruptcy. I am a victim of his deception just as much as anyone else. I would never have lived that way if I knew the truth." I watched her effortlessly throw her husband of 40 years under the bus without a single ounce of hesitation. It was a stunning display of narcissistic self-preservation. "And David," she continued, her voice rising in frantic urgency, "David is a terrible husband. I see that now. I see how awful he has been to you. He hid his embezzlement from both of us. I had no idea he was taking your money. He manipulated the situation. He is a weak, cowardly man, and you were completely right to throw him out. You cannot punish me for the sins of my husband and my son. I am just a mother trying to keep her family together. We are family, Melanie, please." "You cannot do this to your own family." The sheer audacity of the word family coming from her mouth made my blood run absolutely ice cold. She stood there weeping and begging, utterly convinced that if she threw her own flesh and blood to the wolves, I would somehow spare her. She thought I would be moved by her pathetic display. She thought the sight of her crying would trigger some deep-seated maternal empathy inside me. I stared at her shaking hands. I looked at the fingers currently gripping the edge of my desk. I remembered exactly what those hands had done. I remembered Thanksgiving dinner. I remembered the heavy ornate dining room. I remembered my 6-year-old son Leo accidentally bumping a side table. I remembered those exact same hands swinging through the air with vicious, unhinged force. I remembered the sharp, sickening sound of her palm striking my child's face. I remembered Leo hitting the hardwood floor, crying out in shock and pain. My vision narrowed until all I could see was the woman who had physically assaulted my son because she believed her wealth made her untouchable. "You dare use the word family with me," I said. My voice was no longer a professional conversational tone. It was a lethal, localized blizzard. It cut through her sobbing, instantly forcing her to freeze. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. I placed my hands flat on the desk, leaning in so I was only inches away from her tear-stained face. Barbara shrank back slightly, her eyes widening in genuine fear. You stood in my office and just tried to sell out your husband and your son to save your own skin, I stated, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. But we both know that is a lie. I heard you in the mediation room, Barbara. I sat across a frosted glass table and listened to you proudly admit on the official legal record that you advised David to drain my bank accounts. You knew exactly what he was doing. You encouraged it. You benefited from it. You drank champagne paid for by my 60-hour work weeks while treating me like dirt on your shoe. Barbara opened her mouth to protest, but I did not let her speak. You thought you were a queen. I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the office. You thought you could look down on me because I actually work for a living. You thought you could parade around a mansion built on toxic debt and demand my submission. But your entire life is a fraud. You are nothing but a parasite wearing stolen cashmere. Please. Barbara whispered, her voice breaking into a pathetic squeak. I am begging you. I have nothing. I looked into her terrified, defeated eyes. I saw the absolute ruin of her ego. I saw the hollow, empty shell of a woman who had finally realized that she possessed no power, no money, and no allies. I waited for a long, heavy moment, letting the crushing weight of her failure settle firmly onto her shoulders. Then I delivered the final fatal blow. I threw her own devastating cruelty right back into her face. You aren't real family, I said, repeating the exact words she had screamed at my crying 6-year-old son. Get out of my office. Barbara gasped, as if I had driven a physical blade into her chest. She stumbled backward, letting go of my desk. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a loud, wretched sob. She knew exactly what I was doing. She recognized her own horrific words, and the realization that she had authored her own destruction finally broke her completely. I pressed the security button on my desk a second time. The heavy glass door swung open immediately. 2 large, broad-shouldered building security guards stepped into the room. They wore dark suits and stern, unyielding expressions. This woman is trespassing, I instructed the guards, returning my gaze to my computer monitors. Escort her off the premises. If she returns to this building, call the police and have her arrested. The guards moved swiftly. They flanked Barbara on either side, taking her firmly by the elbows. She did not fight them. She had no fight left. Her legs seemed to give out, and she practically collapsed against the guards as they turned her around. Melanie, she wailed one last time, her voice echoing pitifully as they dragged her toward the door. I did not look up from my screen. I did not acknowledge her. The heavy glass door swung shut, cutting off the sound of her crying abruptly. I sat alone in the quiet hum of my corporate fortress. I took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of my suit jacket. The encounter had not drained me. It had energized me. I had looked the monster in the eye and watched her crumble into dust. The Harrison matriarch had been officially deposed, stripped of her crown, and tossed out onto the city sidewalk, like the trash she truly was. But the war was not entirely over yet. They still had one final desperate play left in their playbook, and I was going to be ready for it. I picked up my pen and returned to my quarterly risk assessment, my focus absolute and my victory guaranteed. The remainder of the week passed with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine. By Saturday evening, the city was blanketed in a pristine layer of fresh snow, setting the perfect stage for the Connecticut Heritage Country Club Winter Gala. This event was the undisputed crown jewel of the local high society calendar. For decades, the Harrison family had treated this gala as their personal coronation. They would sweep into the grand ballroom draped in designer labels and hold court among the state's wealthiest families. Tonight, however, the dynamic was going to be radically different. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my master bedroom, adjusting the clasp of a diamond necklace that I had purchased myself to celebrate my promotion to managing partner years ago. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green evening gown that fit with absolute precision. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman entirely in control of her own destiny. I picked up my clutch, kissed a sleeping Leo on the forehead, while his trusted nanny watched over him, and stepped out into the waiting town car. What the Harrisons did not know, and what they were about to discover in the most public way imaginable, was the identity of the gala's primary corporate sponsor. The country club had been struggling with its own minor financial shortfalls over the past year. When the board of directors discreetly reached out for corporate sponsorships to fund the extravagant winter gala, my firm had stepped in. We did not just buy a table, we bought the entire event. My forensic accounting firm was the exclusive marquee sponsor. My corporate logo was currently projected onto the ice sculptures printed on the gold embossed menus and displayed on massive banners flanking the grand entrance. I arrived at the country club and surrendered my coat to the attendant. The grand ballroom was a breathtaking display of winter luxury. Thousands of fairy lights dripped from the vaulted ceiling. A 12-piece orchestra played classical music on a raised stage. The room was packed with politicians, hedge fund managers, and real estate tycoons. As I walked down the sweeping carpeted staircase, the club president, a distinguished man named Arthur Pendleton, immediately broke away from his conversation to greet me. He shook my hand warmly, thanking me profusely for my firm's unprecedented generosity. We stood near the center of the room, discussing a potential audit for his own manufacturing company. Then I saw them. The Harrison family entered the ballroom. The sight of them was a study in desperate, clinging vanity. I knew exactly what it had taken for them to walk through those doors tonight. With their bank accounts frozen and their home under an active eviction notice, they had zero liquid cash. My private investigators had confirmed yesterday that William and Barbara had visited a high-end pawnbroker 2 towns over. Barbara had sold her grandmother's heirloom sapphire brooch, and William had pawned his vintage Rolex watch. They had liquidated their last remaining tangible assets just to scrape together the cash for the mandatory gala tickets and to temporarily appease the club's collection department for their months of unpaid membership dues. They had come tonight for one specific reason. They were hoping to corner a wealthy peer, perhaps a retired banker, or an old real estate buddy of William's, and secure a private, unsecured bridge loan. They needed a bailout, and they thought they could charm their way into a 6-figure check over champagne and caviar. Barbara was wearing a gown I recognized from 3 seasons ago. Courtney looked unnaturally tense, her eyes darting around the room, painfully aware that her luxury car had been repossessed in front of half the people in this room. David trailed behind them, his shoulders hunched, looking entirely out of place without his usual arrogant swagger. It took exactly 4 minutes for Barbara to spot me. She stopped dead in her tracks near the champagne fountain. Her eyes widened as she took in my emerald gown, my relaxed posture, and the fact that I was actively holding court with the club president. Then she looked up and saw my firm's logo projected onto the wall directly above my head. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The money that had paid for this lavish event, the money that had funded the very caviar she was hoping to eat, was mine. Instead of retreating, the sheer blinding panic of her situation overrode whatever tiny shred of logical preservation she had left. Barbara whispered harshly to David and Courtney. The 4 of them formed a tight, aggressive formation and marched directly across the crowded ballroom toward me. They wanted to cause a scene. They figured that if they could publicly accuse me of ruining their family, they could play the victims and garner sympathy from the surrounding elites. Arthur Pendleton noticed their approach. He stiffened slightly, clearly aware of the intense legal and financial drama surrounding the Harrison name. In elite circles, bankruptcy is the only unforgivable sin, and the Harrisons' eviction notice was already the worst-kept secret in the room. Melanie David spat as he closed the distance, deliberately raising his voice to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. Several wealthy couples turned their heads, their conversations halting as they sensed the impending drama. "How dare you show your face here after what you did to this family? You are trying to leave us homeless." Barbara stepped around her son, positioning herself right in front of me. She pasted on a tragic, victimized expression, performing for the gathering audience. "You stole our home," she declared loudly, ensuring her voice carried over the orchestra. "You manipulated the banks, you locked my son out in the cold, and you are trying to destroy our legacy. You are a cold, calculated monster." Courtney chimed in, crossing her arms defensively. "Everyone here needs to know exactly what kind of person you are. You used us." I did not take a step back. I did not raise my voice. I took a slow, elegant sip of my sparkling water, and looked at them with absolute unyielding serenity. The contrast between my perfect composure and their frantic sweating desperation was stark. "David," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet radius around us. "You are currently standing at an event entirely funded by my company wearing a suit I paid for, while your frozen bank accounts are being actively investigated for wire fraud. I highly recommend you lower your voice." David flushed a dark, angry red. He opened his mouth to shout another accusation, but he never got the chance. Arthur Pendleton, the club president, stepped smoothly between us. He did not look at David. He looked directly at William, the fallen patriarch. Arthur's face was a mask of cold, aristocratic disdain. "William Arthur," said, his tone devoid of any former friendship or warmth, "I am going to have to ask you and your family to step away from our premier sponsor. In fact, I am going to have to ask you to step out of this ballroom entirely." William blanched. "Arthur, please, we are members here. We have been members for 25 years. We paid for our tickets tonight." Arthur shook his head slowly. "You paid for your tickets yesterday with a cashier's check. But you did not pay the $40,000 in backlogged membership dues, dining minimums, and event fees that you owe this institution. The board held an emergency meeting this afternoon after the county recorded your commercial eviction notice." Barbara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. The surrounding guests, the very people she had spent her life trying to impress, were now openly staring at her with profound disgust and pity. The absolute worst fear of a social climber was happening to her in real time. "Your membership has been formally revoked by a unanimous vote of the board." Arthur continued, his voice echoing brutally in the quiet space. "The Harrison name has been permanently struck from the registry. You are no longer welcome on these grounds. Furthermore, attempting to accost and harass our primary corporate sponsor at our flagship event is a severe violation of club policy." "This is outrageous," Barbara shrieked, entirely losing her grip on reality. "You cannot do this to us. We belong here. We built this club. You built a mountain of debt," Arthur corrected icily. "And you are currently trespassing on private property." Arthur raised his hand and snapped his fingers twice. Instantly, 4 large, discreetly dressed private security contractors stepped out from the shadows near the ballroom pillars. They moved with swift, silent efficiency, surrounding the Harrison family in a tight square. "Sir, ma'am," the lead security officer said, addressing William and Barbara, "we need you to exit the building immediately. Please walk toward the coat check. Do not cause a disturbance." David looked like he wanted to throw a punch, but he looked at the 4 massive security guards, and his cowardice won out. He shrank back, his bravado entirely deflated. Courtney burst into genuine, humiliating tears, realizing that her social life in this city was completely, irrevocably over. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly as the security team began to shepherd them toward the exit. William looked absolutely broken. He did not say a word. He simply lowered his head and began to walk. Barbara, however, could not accept the defeat. As the security guards firmly guided her away by the elbows, she twisted around to look at me one last time. Her face was contorted with a mixture of pure hatred and absolute terror. She was being marched out of her beloved country club, past all the women who used to envy her, past the politicians she used to host, and past the waitstaff she used to demean. I stood perfectly still, holding my crystal glass, and watched the grand demolition of the Harrison Empire. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply offered her a slow, slight nod of acknowledgement. I had promised to balance the ledger, and the debt was finally paid in full. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom swung shut behind them, cutting off Courtney's sobbing. The orchestra, which had paused during the commotion, smoothly transitioned into a lively waltz. The chatter of the room slowly returned, buzzing with the scandalous, delicious gossip of the Harrisons' spectacular public downfall. Arthur turned back to me, adjusting his tuxedo jacket. "I apologize for that unpleasant interruption, Melanie. Some people simply do not know how to exit with grace." I took a sip of my water, my eyes scanning the beautifully decorated room that my hard work had funded. "There is no need to apologize, Arthur," I replied smoothly. "Sometimes you just have to take out the trash." I spent the rest of the evening exactly as I had intended. I networked with powerful executives. I secured 3 new corporate audit contracts for my firm. I drank excellent champagne and enjoyed the music. The shadow that the Harrison family had cast over my life was completely gone, replaced by the brilliant, undeniable light of my own success. The trap had not just closed, it had completely obliterated the predators inside it. The final legal slaughter in the family court was the only thing left, and I was more than ready to finish the job. The final gavel was about to fall. 3 months after the spectacular implosion at the Winter Gala, I sat in the austere wood-paneled courtroom of the county family court. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and impending ruin. Thomas sat beside me, his briefcase open, meticulously organizing our final exhibits. Across the aisle, David looked like a man who had not slept since November. His posture was entirely defeated, his shoulders curled inward, as if trying to shrink away from the reality of his situation. His aggressive attorney, Richard, shuffled papers with frantic, unfocused energy, completely stripped of the arrogant bluster he had displayed during our mediation session. The judge presiding over our case was a formidable man with zero tolerance for perjury, financial manipulation, or parental negligence. He had spent the entire weekend thoroughly reviewing the mountain of forensic evidence I had submitted. When the judge took his seat, he did not offer pleasantries. He immediately addressed the court, holding up the massive binder containing my comprehensive financial audit. He stated for the official record that in his 25 years on the bench, he had rarely seen such a brazen, thoroughly documented case of marital embezzlement. He systematically laid out the facts for the court. He read aloud the exact routing numbers, the names of the fraudulent Delaware shell companies, and the itemized receipts for Courtney's luxury goods funded entirely by my stolen salary. David stared at his shoes, his face burning a deep, humiliated red. Richard attempted a weak procedural objection regarding the admissibility of the bank records, which the judge instantly overruled with a sharp, echoing snap of his gavel. But the financial fraud was only the beginning of the legal slaughter. The judge shifted his focus to the custody petition. He pulled up the Child Protective Services report, highlighting the malicious anonymous tip that David and Barbara had orchestrated in their failed attempt to terrorize me. He then played the security footage on the large courtroom monitors. The entire gallery watched in horrified silence as an intoxicated David stumbled through my foyer, screamed at a crying 6-year-old Leo, and aggressively shoved past him on the staircase. The judge's face hardened into a mask of pure judicial fury. He looked directly at David and asked how a man who swore an oath of adoption could terrorize a vulnerable child in the dark and then have the audacity to demand sole physical custody simply as a vindictive litigation tactic. David opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but his voice failed him completely under the crushing weight of his own documented actions. The verdict was swift, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating. The judge did not mince words. He addressed David's ridiculous demand for $10,000 a month in permanent spousal support. The judge declared that awarding alimony to a spouse who had actively operated a money laundering scheme within his own marriage would be a profound miscarriage of justice. The request for spousal support was denied with extreme prejudice. David would not receive a single cent of my future earnings, nor would he see a dime from the equity of my highly successful firm. Next, the judge systematically dismantled David's rights as a father. Because David had legally adopted Leo, he was permanently bound to the child by law, but his documented history of severe neglect, emotional abuse, and the weaponization of state welfare agencies rendered him entirely unfit to parent. The court stripped David of all legal and physical custody rights. He was barred from making any educational or medical decisions for my son. However, the judge was not finished. He stated that while David lost the privilege of seeing Leo, he did not lose his financial obligation to the child he had formally adopted. The court ordered David to pay the absolute state maximum in monthly child support. His wages would be aggressively garnished directly from his employer by the state to ensure total compliance. Finally, the judge issued the restitution order for the stolen marital funds. David was ordered to fully repay the $284,000 he had siphoned to fund his sister's lifestyle and his mother's country club dues. Since his bank accounts were already frozen and contained insufficient funds, the judge authorized the forced liquidation of David's remaining personal assets. He was ordered to surrender his luxury watch collection, his golf clubs, his vehicle, and any remaining valuables to a court-appointed liquidator. Every single item he valued would be auctioned off to repay the massive debt he owed me. The gavel struck the sounding block one last time, sealing the total financial and personal annihilation of David Harrison. The fallout was rapid and merciless. Stripped of their estate, their country club membership, and their stolen wealth, the Harrison family was violently ejected from the elite social circles they had worshipped. With zero assets and ruined credit scores, they were forced to rent a cramped, poorly insulated two-bedroom apartment in a low-income industrial neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The four of them, William, Barbara, David, and Courtney, were crammed into a space smaller than their former grand solarium. The tension of their shared failure turned their tiny apartment into a bitter, resentful prison. David had to find immediate employment to satisfy the court-ordered child support and the crushing restitution payments. Stripped of his fake corporate swagger, he managed to secure a mid-level desk job at a regional insurance firm. He spends his days sitting in a gray, windowless cubicle, staring blankly at spreadsheets. Every 2 weeks, the state intercepts his paycheck, aggressively garnishing his wages before the money even hits his account. He brings home just enough to cover his share of the meager rent and basic groceries. The arrogant man who used to sneer at my forensic accounting career is now drowning in administrative drudgery, forever shackled to the financial debt he created. Courtney suffered an equally satisfying descent into harsh reality. Without my stolen salary to fund her designer lifestyle and with her parents entirely bankrupt, she was forced to enter the workforce for the very first time in her life. She currently works as a cashier at a mid-tier retail clothing store in a suburban shopping mall. She spends her shifts scanning barcodes, folding synthetic sweaters, and dealing with difficult customers. She has to wear a polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. Whenever she spots a former acquaintance from her elite social days walking into the store, she frantically hides in the stockroom to avoid the crushing humiliation of being seen ringing up discount apparel. Barbara and William rarely leave their tiny apartment. The woman who once hosted lavish charity luncheons now clips grocery coupons and watches daytime television on a small, outdated screen. They are entirely isolated, ostracized by the wealthy peers who discarded them the exact moment their fraud was exposed. Their grand legacy is nothing but dust and cautionary gossip among the people they used to rule. As for the Harrison estate, I did not keep it. I had absolutely no desire to live in a mansion built on toxic debt and false superiority. Once the eviction was finalized and the property was legally cleared of their possessions, I placed the massive estate on the commercial market. A luxury real estate developer purchased the land within a week for a staggering premium. They did not want the house, they wanted the acreage. I signed the closing documents and authorized the immediate demolition. Heavy machinery rolled onto the property and bulldozers systematically tore down the grand foyer, the sweeping staircase, and the pretentious dining room where Barbara had slapped my son. The physical manifestation of the Harrison empire was literally crushed into rubble and hauled away in dump trucks to make room for a new upscale subdivision. The sale of the estate yielded a multi-million-dollar profit for my holding company. I took that massive influx of capital and put it to work. I established an ironclad, highly diversified trust fund for Leo. It is structured so securely that he will never have to worry about educational expenses, medical emergencies, or financial instability for the rest of his life. I took the remaining funds and established a charitable foundation in the name of my late first husband, Leo's biological father. The foundation provides financial literacy training and pro bono legal support for single mothers escaping domestic and financial abuse. I turned the exact weapon the Harrisons tried to use against me into a permanent shield for women who desperately needed protection. Life has settled into a beautiful, unshakable rhythm. I purchased a modern, highly secure home in a quiet, heavily wooded neighborhood. The house is filled with warmth, natural light, and the sounds of genuine laughter. There are no antique wine glasses to guard, and there are no toxic egos to manage. We live on our own terms, surrounded only by people who earn their place in our lives through respect and kindness. On a quiet Thursday evening, I stood in my new kitchen, tossing a fresh salad while a homemade lasagna bubbled in the oven. Leo sat at the kitchen island, his legs swinging happily as he completed a complex puzzle. He looked up at me, his eyes bright and completely free of the anxiety that used to plague him in the Harrison house. He laughed at a joke I made, the sound echoing purely through our safe, peaceful home. The bruise on his cheek had faded months ago, but the lesson I learned that night would remain with me forever. I served dinner, taking a seat across from my thriving, happy son. We ate together, discussing his school day and planning a weekend trip to the Science Museum. I looked around my home, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of victory. I had faced a family of predators who thought my kindness was a weakness. They believed my wealth was theirs to take and my child was theirs to abuse. I did not just defend myself against their attacks. I meticulously and legally dismantled their entire existence. I learned that true power does not roar. It calculates. And I learned that sometimes the absolute best way to truly protect your peace and secure your future is to lock the doors, light the match, and watch a toxic empire burn entirely to the ground.